Now, we're going to talk about some various hardware options that you have. I talked about um, we've been talking about working with virtual machines in VMware Workstation 12. Um, Most of what I am saying will apply seamlessly to version 15 as well, and might actually be easier. Now, there's some things you can only do when a VM is powered off. For one of those is change the amount of RAM that it uses. You cannot do that while it is running. Um, Not with VMware Workstation. Definitely not with VMware. Well, with Player, you don't even really see those choices. Um, Now, when you think about this, you should make sure that you have enough physical RAM so that every VM has the recommended minimum memory for its OS and what it's doing on top of the OS. Now, you don't have to have enough physical RAM for every virtual machine on the every guest OS you created to run simultaneously. If you have um, 20 VMs for various purposes and you never plan to run more than 5 or 6, then what you need is the memory to support those 5 or 6. Um, Technically speaking, this having you can probably get away with um, having more VMs running than you have memory to support nominally. Say, for example, you've got 16 gigs of RAM, and your OS takes about 6. Um, and you decide to run, let's say, 7 VMs that all need 2 gigs of RAM. Doing the math, that's 14 gigs of RAM for your VMs, plus another 6 or 7 for the OS. That adds up to 20 or 21 gigs, which exceeds the 16 you have. But if your VMs aren't going to use all of that, you may be able to get away with it. This is a process we call overcommitment. It's like overbooking an airline flight. But like overbooking an airline flight, you run the risk that everybody who has signed up for a seat on that flight will show up. And then somebody is going to be really, really upset because you sold them a seat that you couldn't put them in. In our world, that means you may have, if all of your VMs suddenly need all of their capacity, because usually computers don't run at full memory capacity. Let's look at mine for a minute. Look at my performance for just a second. So this is me. I am running at 7 out of my 32 gigs of memory available. Um, so, I mean, if you know your virtual machines aren't going to push their resources to the limit, maybe you can get away with more than what looks like work, with more than seems feasible on paper. But that's not a risk you should take without thinking about what you're trying to accomplish and whether it will do what you mean it to do. Um, on the other hand, this is a college course. This is the place, if any, where you can experiment with things like that, see how far you can push things. So if one day you just decide to spin up as many VMs as possible and see how long it takes, how many VMs running, how much with how much memory it takes you to bring your host PC to a halt, go for it. Learn something. If you want to change the memory, you can double-click the Devices pane on the VM tab. You can go into Settings, change it there. One of the other things you can do, this is actually something you can do while the VM is running. There are kinds of hardware changes you can make while the VM is running and kinds that you can't. You can change the ISO or CD drive settings while the machine is running. You could even, if you don't have an optical drive in the machine, but you have, say, a USB optical drive, you could plug this in. VMware will say, hey, you have a USB device. What do you want to do with it? Connect it to the guest or leave it connected to the host. If you leave it connected to the guest, boom, you'll notice a CD. And if there's a CD in that drive, that'll work. Yeah, so you can also, on a new VM, you can, when you're installing a new virtual machine, you can use either the CD or a disk image file. If it's something that for whatever reason, say DRM or whatnot, you have to install from a disk because there's a key on that disk or whatnot, either you need a physical disk, a physical drive on the platform, like say, for example, the little thin drives we have in the PowerEdge R630s in Room 220, or something like this that you can plug into the machine when you need it and not when you don't. And of course, you'll have to have physical media. If you're using a physical drive, you have to use physical media. If you're using an ISO file, you can just point it that way. Now, one thing that you may have to work on a bit. Say let's take and this is actually something I've tried. You can have more than one. You can add more than one virtual CD to to a virtual machine. Say for example, all three of the really big multi-gigabyte ISO images for say Debian 10. If you want to throw everything at the kitchen sink and the kitchen sink at it. That doesn't work all that well because the installer may not know how to transition between those things with a VM. I've tried it that way once, trying to get Debian 10 to install, and it didn't work very well. Your best bet, honestly, with something like that is to go with a small ISO image, like say the net install or the XCFE install, and then let your package management system do the work over the network. There's also VMware Tools. It's available for both Windows and Linux. It will give you some drivers. It'll allow you to interoperate with the host system better. You can add a virtual hard disk. Now, the thing to note here with adding the virtual hard disks is that some of these you can add while it's running and some of these you can't. Technically speaking, while it's running, if you add, say, a SCSI drive, you can add it, but the VM won't see it. On the other hand, at least with Linux, you can add a new SATA drive, and it will show up right away. So pay really close attention to whether you're adding IDE, SATA, SCSI, SAS, or whatnot. Understand when you start the process at what point you'll need to reboot. And of course, when you add that virtual disk, it's like adding a disk that you just bought off the shelf and took home and plugged in. It will not have any formatting. It will not have any partitioning. It will be blank, empty, low-level data storage. And you'll have to do all the work with the disk and partition management and formatting tools that you have available in the OS in question. We've done that in the Linux class, in the servers class. So if you need to do something like this, just go forward with it. I'm going to talk about network operations next. Thank you for watching.